Happy Tuesday, everybody. Welcome to another episode of China Update, where we discuss leading political, economic, and geostrategic analysis of the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. We have a big one today, so let's jump in. It's official. China is responsible for the global pandemic through a lab leak. That is, according to the White House, at least. The Trump administration has reignited discussion over the origins of COVID-19 by replacing the federal government's main pandemic information websites with a new page asserting that the virus most likely emerged from a laboratory incident in China. Titled Lab Leak, The True Origins of COVID-19, the page goes beyond previous intelligence assessments, declaring that, quote, a lab-related incident involving gain-of-function research is most likely the origin of COVID-19. End quote. The shift marks a departure from the positions of agencies like the US CIA, which recently stated that a research-related origin was more likely than a natural one. The new White House page features images of President Donald Trump and satellite views of Wuhan, home of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, where coronavirus research was conducted. It criticizes both Chinese safety protocols and the global response to the pandemic, including decisions made by the WHO and US public health leaders. While the FBI and the Department of Energy have lent support to the lab leak hypothesis, 5 other US intelligence bodies continue to consider a natural zoonotic spillover from animals, such as raccoon dogs sold at Wuhan's illegal wild animal market, more likely. Critics warn that the administration's decision to replace public health resources with this messaging risks further politicizing a scientific debate that remains unresolved. Intelligence agencies have said that without cooperation from China, particularly access to early case data and lab records, definitive conclusions may remain out of reach. Some commentators push back, however, saying that this conclusion shouldn't be controversial and that seeking cooperation from China to investigate the origins of COVID-19 is like seeking cooperation from a killer to prove their murder. It's not going to happen. Beijing firmly rejects the lab leak hypothesis and still insists that it's not even proven that COVID started in China, with some officials even maintaining that it started in the US. Veteran China analyst Bill Bishop observed on this development today, quote, if the Trump administration is going to push hard on lab leak as the origin, US-China relations will get even worse. End quote. Though I would argue it is difficult to imagine that US-China relations outside of kinetic conflict could get much worse. The cost of the pandemic is difficult to understate. Millions dead, societies and nations shaken, and a monetary amount estimated to be conservatively $100 trillion, and by some counts as high as $300 trillion. If there was culpability, like negligence around a lab leak and then an official cover-up, it would be the crime of the century. However, it is likely that we will never truly know. Next up, as the US ramps up pressure on global trading partners to isolate China through punitive tariffs and conditional exemptions, Beijing is pushing back with increasingly forceful rhetoric and clear warnings of retaliation. In a series of public statements this week, China's Ministry of Commerce and state media have signaled that any country seeking favorable trade terms from Washington at Beijing's expense will face consequences. In a sharply worded statement on Monday, a Ministry of Commerce spokesperson condemned the US for using the pretext of reciprocity to enforce what it called, quote, hegemonic politics and unilateral bullying in the economic and trade field. End quote. The spokesperson warned that appeasing Washington would bring neither peace nor respect. Quote, seeking exemptions at the expense of others' interests for one's own temporary benefit is like asking a tiger for its skin, end quote, the official said, using an old Chinese adage, adding, quote, China firmly opposes any party reaching deals at the expense of China's interests. If such a situation occurs, China will resolutely take countermeasures in equal measure. End quote. This assertive stance was echoed by state-run broadcaster CCTV, which published a commentary titled, In the Face of the Tariff War, Appeasement is Never an Option. The piece warned that compromising with the US would only, quote, embolden its aggression, end quote, adding, quote, negotiating with a tiger will only lead to being devoured by the tiger, end quote. The article also advocated, quote, resolute struggle, end quote, adopting a Maoist term as the only viable path forward. The Chinese response comes as the Trump administration continues its sweeping tariff strategy, having imposed duties of up to 245% on Chinese goods. US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has floated the idea of brokering deals with allies like Japan and Europe before turning to Beijing with a coordinated front. Meanwhile, US officials are pressuring countries to reduce their imports of Chinese goods, particularly those transshipped through third countries. This puts many nations in a difficult position as they attempt to balance economic ties with both superpowers. Few countries want to be seen as choosing sides, but the growing demands from Washington, and now Beijing, make neutrality increasingly untenable. Countries like Japan and South Korea are currently engaged in bilateral trade discussions with the US, while China courts partners in Southeast Asia and Europe to shore up support. On my other channel, Market Update, which has just been published, we've been exploring these other trade talks between Washington and these Asian and European allies. I put a link to today's episode of Market Update in the description below. Check it out if you're interested in this space. General Secretary Xi Jinping's recent visits to Vietnam, Malaysia and Cambodia are part of a broader diplomatic campaign to bind regional economies more closely to China. These efforts align with China's so-called dual circulation strategy, which aims to reinforce domestic resilience while deepening global supply chain dependencies on the Chinese market. In almost every bilateral or multilateral statement, Beijing emphasizes the importance of protecting global supply chains, a phase increasingly understood to mean maintaining the dominance of China-centric production networks. While China has pursued this strategy for some time now, when it comes to market size, the US is still bigger, which would explain why many countries have traveled to Washington to sign deals. In response to the escalating trade war, China is also bolstering domestic economic support measures. The Ministry of Finance is rolling out the first batch of ultra-long special treasury bonds earlier than usual, aiming at funding infrastructure and consumption subsidies. The goal, stabilize growth amid external headwinds. The government plans to raise 1.3 trillion yuan, $178 billion through such bonds in 2025, up from 1 trillion yuan in 2024. At the same time, the People's Bank of China, China's central bank, has kept its loan prime rates steady for the 6th consecutive month, holding the 1-year LPR at 3.1% and the 5-year at 3.6%. While analysts believe the central bank may eventually lower reserve requirements to spur lending, it is hesitant to cut interest rates outright, wary of triggering capital flight and further weakening the currency. Amid all this, there are signs that Beijing is exploring diplomatic off-ramps. Some analysts say Chinese officials are quietly reaching out to third-party experts to assess whether a negotiated resolution to US pressure is feasible. But for now, the public message remains defiant. Appeasement is off the table, and China is ready to retaliate against any country that jeopardizes its interests in pursuit of a US tariff reprieve. With both Washington and Beijing pressing their influence on the global stage, many countries are left walking a diplomatic tightrope. But as the Chinese government makes clear, choosing sides will not be without consequences. We are certainly living in interesting times. We are very much living history. If you want to be on top of this trade war and this emerging Cold War, make sure you're subscribed to China Update and you will be on top of the most important, salient and consequential developments as they're released every day. If you're getting some value from today's episode of China Update, don't forget to hit the like button. Let's continue. Chinese electric vehicle and battery makers are outpacing global rivals in the quality, not quantity, of their EV-related patents. That is according to a new study by Tokyo-based Mitsui & Co. Global Strategic Studies Institute, MGSSI. Despite holding fewer patents than US or Japanese firms, the Japanese institute argues that Chinese companies like CATL and BYD are scoring high in technological impact, measured by citation rates and patent longevity. Quote, Chinese players have fewer patents, but they carefully select the ones they apply for, end quote, said MGSSI Senior Manager Rusuke Ishiguro. The strategic focus could allow Chinese firms to license their technologies to US manufacturers as a workaround to rising tariffs imposed by the Trump administration. Licensing offers a path to revenue without building factories in the United States, as patent holders can earn royalties from local production. CATL, for example, has partnered with Ford on a US-based battery plant and may see its technology used in a new facility by Japan's TDK supplying General Motors. While Japan's Toyota leads in the number of EV patents, CATL topped the Impact Index at 2.7, well above the 1.0 average. MGSSI noted a growing number of patents focused on battery control and longevity, critical areas as automakers pivot toward zero-emission, software-driven vehicles. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching. Have a good Tuesday.